Okay, so it's much the same question as before, but applied to early modern Ireland. So it's, what do you think the role will be of archival and theoretical approaches to studies of early modern Ireland?
I think in the context of Ireland, archival material is going to be absolutely crucial. There's been a problem, and the problem has been, I mean, just to give it a name, Anglocentrism. And that problem has meant that very often when people have been looking at 16th, 17th century material, they've been kind of aware out of the corner of their eye of the importance of Ireland, but they've not really taken it on board, they've not taken it into account. If you look at something like the Dictionary of National Biography, many writers are mentioned, many figures are mentioned who had some connection with Ireland, but that's always an aside or an afterthought. It's never structural, it's never underpinning their life and work. And I think what the archive on the Irish side can do is, if you like, remind those Anglo-centric historians and biographers that Ireland was of the first importance. That's the first thing. The second thing is Irish language sources. I think that's an enormous untapped reservoir of material, so that will absolutely transform things. And I think there is a third thing which is often forgotten about, which is about the diaspora and also about globalisation or internationalisation or Europeanisation. We're in a moment of Brexit just now. In the 16th and 17th century, the English state, sometimes called the British state as it later emerged, the English state was fundamentally in opposition to Europe. It was almost at war with Europe. There are complications there. It's not all as it seems, and I could state some of those complications. But the fact is, part of the British project at the time, as Francis Bacon put it, was to get the Spanish out of Ireland and the French out of Scotland. So it wasn't just to de-Europeanise England, it was to de-Europeanise Britain. And I think that's fundamental to the roots of where we are now. And I think the fact that Ireland was not a backwater or a backwoods in Europe, the fact that Ireland was an ancient European nation that was integrally part of Europe, as was Scotland, I think that's really important. And I think work being done now on Ireland, and has been done in the past, but more work's been done now to show that Ireland, if you like, was key to European developments, to global developments, and I think that's absolutely crucial. And that's one of the ways in which archival work in Ireland can locate Ireland globally and internationally.
Has the new British history had its day?
I'm always interested in the fact that people want things to be passing fashions and to fade quickly. I mean, you're only just catching up in some piece of music that you listen to that turns out to be from the 1960s, so it's passé, it's gone, but it's come back and it's of interest and it engages you. I think the same is true of something like the New British History. I don't even know if the New British History, as it was called, that emerged in the 1980s, has been fully understood, fully institutionalised, fully thought through. I don't think it has been. I think definitely the high point of what was called the British problem, or the New British History, British Studies if you like, from Pocock in the 1970s onwards, I think that's morphed and changed, but it's only 10 years since John Kerrigan's huge book, Archipelagic English, appeared on the scene. And I still read that book. I've gone back to it most recently to read the chapter on Macbeth. 2 years ago I gave a lecture on Robinson Crusoe and I went back to read the chapter on Defoe. What incredible riches. Has that been taken on board? Absolutely not. So I think the New British Studies is still at an early stage. Of course it can be complicated, and some people are allergic to the word British in British Studies because they would say it's British and Irish, or it's English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish and so on. And I'm open to that. But I think there's still life in the New British History, and I think we shouldn't be too quick, and I think we often are too quick to say deconstruction is dead, Marxism is over and so on. I think the people who are in a hurry to bury theories and approaches are often doing so for some kind of political reasons or other kinds of reasons, or because they want to come in with the next thing they consider to be new. So in that sense, I'm quite old-fashioned, and I think there's mileage still in the new British history, because I think it was an attempt to address the multiple nature of English and British colonialism and imperialism. And even though it did a disservice perhaps to Scotland, to Wales and to Ireland, despite its efforts to bring them in, as it were, did a disservice to them, I think there's definitely life in the new British history.
And finally, whether archipelagic studies?
Archipelagic studies, John Kerrigan talked about archipelagic Macbeth as the new term for Macbeth, and he joked about whether it would catch on. And I think archipelagic is not a word that's popular in the street, but then neither particularly is British imperial monarchy or British Empire, although they're real things that people are living with and dealing with in their ignorance. So I think archipelagic English, that brave title for that big book, I mean, to write a book of 250,000 words of that importance and give it a title, I actually think that when I read the typescript of archipelagic English, I suggested to John Kerrigan that he use a different title, because precisely for that reason, archipelagic is a kind of geographical term, which, so it might say in that sense, might seem politically correct or non-controversial, but rather than say British, which is controversial and contentious. But I think archipelagic, now the irony is archipelagic studies is coming into a lot of different areas, including geography, and there's journals of archipelagic studies, there's a book on archipelagic modernism. So I think in a way it's not set the heather alight, but it's singed a little bit of purple heather, perhaps somewhere, some patch and some mountainside. So I think archipelagic studies should be a step forward from the new British history, because it doesn't use the word British and it recognises that North Atlantic archipelago, it recognises these islands, if you want to use that complicated expression. It's an attempt to bring some kind of geographical neutrality to talking about the British state and empire and its relations with its kind of cognate and neighbouring Celtic nations. So I think there's still life in archipelagic studies. I think archipelagic studies, as it happens, is probably taken more of a grip in other areas. Now people talk about archipelagic poetry and so on. In early modern studies, it's slightly awkward because I don't think a work like John Kerrigan's has really been taken on board yet, but I think very slowly, and it's happening now in a kind of wave of essays after that big book. I'm sure that it will become increasingly important, and I'm still attached to it despite having issues with the title. Of course, there is an irony, and that is archipelagic English there being, if you like, English literature. Mm-hmm. And I think that English literature is not neutral. It's not neutral either. So you can say British is a problem, let's say archipelagic, but if you're still saying English rather than say archipelagic studies or archipelagic cultures or archipelagic, politics or history, that's different. But as I said at the beginning in relation to words like criticism, crisis and political criticism, the language is complicated, and I think people disagree on words, even if they end up using the same words, because in some ways, when Derrida said text and Foucault ridiculed him for being reductive, Derrida's notion of text wasn't so different from Foucault's notion of discourse, but they used different words. By discourse, Foucault meant something that was political, that was engaged, that was problematic and so on. And I think Derrida meant the same thing by text, although Foucault talked about textualisation as a kind of trivialisation of politics, and although people like Terry Eagleton, Edward Said followed Foucault down the line of discourse as politics and Foucault as the more political, I think that lost touch with the fact that Derrida wasn't so far away from Foucault in terms of levels of engagement with language and history and politics.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to add that you haven't said in answer to these questions?
I would probably say this is a new forum, because in some ways talking in like this is almost like it's some elements of a monologue and of talking to yourself, even when there are questions or when the questions are taken away. That's how interviews operate. The first time I did an interview, I was surprised when I realised the questions were removed, and it made it look as if I was speaking to an agenda that wasn't my agenda. I didn't know this was how things happened. This was actually a BBC documentary, but they asked me questions that were their questions, but it seemed as though I had particular passions and interests. As I say, I'm a sceptic when it comes to crisis, because I think the crisis has been around a long time, and people have been dealing with it and suffering it. And I also think criticism, it usually is the kind of criticism that one does, that we do, that we value, and we don't value other kinds of criticism. Whereas, take something like New Historicism. When I started to read historical criticism from 100 years ago, started to read through the archive, if you like, I became much more tolerant and much more broad-minded about what counted as good historical criticism. So I think that it's about modishness and about being caught up in the contemporary moment, caught up in our own values and work and so on. We tend to disrespect or to disregard earlier forms of work, and I'm really enjoying hanging around the 17th century just now, loitering with intent, and I think you learn a lot about the debates that were in play then, the impact on today. So the crisis has been with us for a long time, and so has the criticism. Is that okay, Lou?